The Borgata Hotel Casino and Spa opened on the Marina District of Atlantic City on July 2, 2003. It was not the largest casino in Atlantic City. It was not the oldest. It was not the most historically significant. It was the best. The Borgata was developed by a joint venture between MGM Mirage and Boyd Gaming at a construction cost of approximately $1.1 billion, with a design philosophy and operational standard that represented the first genuine attempt to bring the competitive hospitality quality of the Las Vegas Strip to Atlantic City's casino market. The food and beverage program, the spa, the hotel room quality, the entertainment booking, every element of the Borgata's operation was calibrated to a standard that no existing Atlantic City property had previously attempted, and that the market immediately rewarded with occupancy rates, average daily rates, and gaming revenue per square foot that made the Borgata the most commercially successful casino in Atlantic City history for most of the decade following its opening. The Borgata was Atlantic City's answer to the question of whether the market could support a luxury product at the level that Las Vegas had established as the new competitive standard. The answer was yes. It did not matter. MGM Resorts International, which had consolidated its interest in the Borgata through the Boyd Gaming joint venture and subsequent transactions, sold its 50% interest in the property in 2016 and sold its remaining interest in 2019, completing a full exit from Atlantic City at the precise moment when the city's gaming market had stabilized following the 5 closings documented in Case File 019. The Borgata was not sold because it was failing. It was sold because Atlantic City was the wrong market for MGM's capital allocation strategy, regardless of how well the Borgata performed within it. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between asset quality and market positioning. Because the Borgata documents the proposition that a property of genuine excellence in a market that an institutional operator has determined is strategically irrelevant to its portfolio can be divested regardless of its individual performance, and that the market's assessment of an individual asset and the operator's assessment of the market can point in opposite directions simultaneously. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. MGM Resorts International's decision to exit Atlantic City through the sale of its Borgata interest was not produced by the Borgata's operational failure. It was produced by MGM's strategic reassessment of Atlantic City as a market worthy of continued capital allocation at a time when the company's growth opportunities in other markets, primarily the domestic regional casino expansion enabled by state gaming legalization and the international markets in Macau and Singapore, were generating returns that the Atlantic City market, regardless of the Borgata's individual performance, could not match. The specific mechanism of the exit reflects a pattern that institutional real estate operators employ when they determine that a high-quality asset is in a market they no longer want to serve, rather than allowing the asset to deteriorate to the point where sale becomes forced. They sell the asset at a premium that its quality commands and redeploy the capital to markets that better fit their strategic priorities. MGM's exit from the Borgata was a disciplined institutional portfolio decision, not a distressed sale. The covenant that MGM had implicitly made with Atlantic City through its construction of the Borgata was the one embedded in the investment's civic dimension. A $1.1 billion commitment to the quality of the Atlantic City hospitality market carried an implicit promise that the standards it established would be maintained for the duration of the asset's useful life, not for the period that happened to align with the investor's preferred holding period. That civic dimension of the investment was not in any document. It was not legally enforceable, but it was real in the sense that Atlantic City's political and community leadership had held up the Borgata's opening as evidence that quality investment in the city's hospitality market was possible, and that the city's recovery thesis rested partially on the Borgata's continued demonstration that the market could support premium standards. MGM's exit did not immediately destroy the Borgata's quality. Boyd Gaming, which acquired MGM's interest, has maintained the property at a standard consistent with its positioning. But the exit removed the institutional anchor that had been part of the Borgata's identity since its opening. At what point does an institutional investor's disciplined portfolio management decision conflict with the civic expectations that a major public investment had created? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that governed MGM's exit transactions produced sale prices that reflected the Borgata's genuine quality and its demonstrated commercial performance in the Atlantic City market. The sale was not distressed. The pricing was not below market. The transaction documentation does not reveal a seller attempting to exit at any available price. The appraisal failure documented in this case is therefore not the conventional failure that previous case files have examined, the treatment of peak cycle performance as a permanent baseline, or the mispricing of structural competitive decline, or the misidentification of a regulatory constraint as a temporary obstacle. The appraisal failure in the Borgata case is at the market level rather than the asset level. MGM's strategic analysis of the Atlantic City market had concluded that the market's long-term growth trajectory, even with the Borgata operating at its demonstrated commercial standard, was insufficient to justify the continued allocation of capital that would be required to maintain the property at that standard over a multi-decade holding period. The specific competitive dynamics that informed that assessment included the legalization of gaming in neighboring states, documented in Case File 019, which had progressively reduced Atlantic City's geographic monopoly on regional gaming demand, and which the Borgata's quality advantage could mitigate but not overcome. The Borgata could outperform every other Atlantic City casino while the market itself declined relative to the markets that MGM was entering in other states and internationally. That is not a conventional appraisal finding. It is a strategic finding about the relationship between asset-level performance and market-level trajectory. The appraisal of an individual property in a declining market correctly values the property above its competitors in the same market, while correctly identifying that the premium the property commands over its competitors is insufficient to compensate for the market structural disadvantage relative to the markets competing for the same capital. The Borgata was correctly priced in Atlantic City terms. Atlantic City was correctly priced in MGM's portfolio terms. The two correct pricings led to the same conclusion: the best casino in a market that MGM had determined was strategically non-competitive was a candidate for sale. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The timing of MGM's Borgata exit coincided with the stabilization of the Atlantic City market following the 5 casino closings documented in Case File 019, a timing that MGM's management characterized as consistent with having waited for the market rationalization to complete before divesting the asset. The market rationalization had eliminated the properties that could not compete with the Borgata's quality and service standard, leaving a smaller but more viable competitive set in which the Borgata's dominant position was more secure than it had been when 12 casinos were competing for the same gaming revenue pool. MGM sold at the moment when the Borgata's competitive position was at its strongest relative to the remaining Atlantic City market. That timing is not coincidental. It reflects the institutional logic of a seller who has determined that the best time to exit a high-quality asset in a constrained market is at the moment when the asset's market position is strongest, and the market's trajectory is beginning to be re-established following a period of disruption. The institutional denial in this case is not embedded in any individual decision-maker's assessment of the Atlantic City market. MGM's strategic analysis was correct that the market's long-term growth potential was insufficient to justify continued capital allocation at the level a property of the Borgata's quality required. The denial was collective and civic. Atlantic City's continued presentation of itself as a market capable of attracting institutional quality capital investment at the standards the Borgata had established. In the face of MGM's exit and the broader structural evidence that the market's geographic captive advantage had been permanently reduced by the gaming legalization in neighboring states. The Borgata's quality had demonstrated what Atlantic City could produce. MGM's exit demonstrated what Atlantic City could not guarantee: the continued commitment of institutional capital to maintaining that standard in a market whose structural dynamics were pulling in the opposite direction from the investment commitment required. Boyd Gaming, as the sole owner since 2019, has maintained the Borgata's operational standard. The crown jewel is still there. The institution that built it has decided it belonged in a different jewelry case. The Borgata Hotel Casino and Spa continues to operate in Atlantic City's Marina District as the most commercially successful casino in the market and as the clearest evidence available that the Atlantic City gaming market is capable of supporting a luxury hospitality product at a standard competitive with any gaming destination in the United States. Boyd Gaming's stewardship of the property since the completion of MGM's exit has maintained the operational standard that the original development established, demonstrating that the Borgata's quality is reproducible without the MGM institutional anchor that had been part of its identity. The Borgata's continued success coexists with the structural constraints that MGM's exit had identified as the reason for divesting: the geographic captive market erosion documented in Case File 019, the Atlantic City market's continued exposure to competitive pressure from Pennsylvania and Maryland gaming, and the broader dynamics of a regional gaming market whose growth ceiling is determined by factors outside Atlantic City's control. What the Borgata case reveals in the context of this channel's 42 case archive is the specific category of strategic divestiture that produces the appearance of institutional failure without the financial mechanics of conventional collapse. The Borgata did not file for bankruptcy. MGM did not exit at a loss. The property did not close, deteriorate, or change its competitive positioning. What the case documents is the institutional reality that a property of genuine excellence in a market that strategic capital has determined is non-competitive is a divestiture candidate regardless of its individual performance, and that the civic expectations that a major quality investment creates are not legally enforceable claims on the continued presence of the institutional investor. Atlantic City built its post-rationalization recovery narrative around the Borgata's demonstrated quality. MGM built its post-Atlantic City growth narrative around the markets that the Borgata's capital could fund if deployed elsewhere. Both narratives were internally coherent. They were pointing in different directions. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between asset quality and institutional commitment in regional gaming markets, subscribe, because the next case examines what happens when the commitment is made by a public entity rather than a private one, and whether public commitment is more durable than institutional capital allocation. And in the comments, given MGM's documented strategic rationale for exiting a performing asset in a market it had determined was non-competitive, what specific covenant in the original development agreement would have most effectively aligned MGM's holding period with Atlantic City's recovery timeline? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.